What is going on, and welcome back to another episode of I Coach Nutrition Radio. Today's podcast, we're going to dive into the topic of carb cycling. This is something that's become, I've been getting quite a few questions about this recently, as this is not a new topic by any means, but for some reason it's kind of resurfaced and it's, kind of gained traction and gained, popularity. Become more popular here as of late. So there's a reason carb cycling is so popular, right? According to the people that are the most enthusiastic about it, which are a lot of the times fit people, they're fit influencers that are kind of pushing this. If you talk to them, it's like this is the perfect diet, right? There's all these carb cycling challenges that are out there, and kind of the I guess the motivation behind it, or the things that can happen from doing it, is people will talk about accelerated fat loss, right? People will talk about still being able to eat carbohydrates without restricting or without sacrificing exercise performance. People will talk about avoiding like frustrating fat loss plateaus. People will talk about gaining muscle without gaining body fat. Things like that, right? And so really what we have to break down here is, are these claims true, right? And if so, right, do they hold true for you, right? Will they work for you and your lifestyle? So what this podcast is going to be about today is we're going to be kind of diving into carb cycling. We're going to be talking about, should you give it a try or not? Or if you could get just as good, if not better, results from, just simply living a healthy lifestyle without having to go into more of this complex protocol of carb cycling. All right. And then also something to think about here, right, is that a lot of the strategies, right, when you hear about, what it means to live a sustainable, healthy lifestyle, a lot of the times for most people, this is actually going to be more effective. And it's going to require a lot less effort than what it takes to do, carb cycling. And again, just to kind of state my position here, I'm not for or against carb cycling. To each their own. There's some people that it works great for. There's some people that it works terrible for. So it really just depends on the person. I care a lot more about results and sustainable results rather than just trying to get really, really quick results and then just losing them, right? So what we're going to go over here is what is carb cycling. We're going to go over how it works. We're going to go over whether or not carb cycling is the right strategy for you. We're going to go over how to carb cycle, if that is something that you decide to do. And then we're also going to determine if carb cycling, like if your actual carb cycling plan that you're doing is actually working. And that way you can make sure you're getting the results that you really want. Okay. So let's kind of dive into this here. All right. So what is carb cycling? All right. Carb cycling is when you fluctuate between eating low carb foods and high carb foods. Right. The most common carb cycling approach is to eat fewer carbohydrates on some days and more carbohydrates on other days. Right. People who carb cycle usually end up calorie cycling as well. Right. This means they eat fewer calories on their low carb days and they eat more calories on their high carb days. Right. So, for example, a typical carb cycling schedule might look like this. On non-workout days, do low carb and therefore low calorie, or and then on workout days, do high carbohydrate, therefore higher calorie. Right. But that's not the only way to cycle your carbs. Some people carb cycle within a single day. So they'll eat high carb foods around their workout, but have low carb foods the rest of the day. Because a typical carb cycling schedule requires counting macros and really, really good planning, nutritional planning. You have to consider it as an intermediate to advanced nutrition strategy, right? It's kind of a pain to do, right? And it can be pretty challenging for most people to do it well. And so as a result, it tends to work best for those who are highly motivated, right? Like amateur and elite athletes, bodybuilders, and people who are paid based on how they look and perform. And typically not just like general population, right? So you might be wondering, why focus on only carbs and not protein or fat, right? So first and foremost, varying your carbohydrate intake may have a positive impact on many important hormones, right? And we'll dig into that here, later. But fluctuating your fat and protein intake, on the other hand, won't really affect hormones for the better. And there's also the fact that, you know, not so great stuff can happen when you don't get enough protein or fat, right? So for example, if your fat intake stays too low, your menstrual cycle might come to a halt. And if your protein intake stays too low, you can lose muscle and experience mood swings, right? And you're probably not interested in any of that, right? So let's just keep this conversation about carbohydrates for now. All right, so what does carb cycling do exactly, right? So in theory, it can do quite a few things. So we'll give you kind of a rundown here of the top 5 potential benefits of carb cycling. But before I do that, it's important to know that there's hardly any human research on carb cycling. Let me say that again. There's hardly any human research on carb cycling. Right? Mostly we have anecdotal reports about how carb cycling works, along with a few hypotheses based on biochemistry. So those are valuable, right? But on a 1 to 10 scale of scientific confidence, carb cycling ranks closer to a 1 than a 10. So keep that in mind when you hear or read claims about carb cycling. All right, enough with kind of the disclaimers here, right? Let's get into what carb cycling might do. So number 1, carb cycling may help keep your metabolism humming during fat loss, right? When you eat less, say to lose fat, your body responds in a variety of ways. For example, your basal metabolic rate or your BMR drops. You expend less energy when you exercise. Your daily activity outside of workouts tends to decrease naturally. You move around less without even realizing it. So as you lose weight, you have to continue reducing how much you eat in order to keep seeing results. So for example, let's say you start a 2,000 calorie a day diet and lose weight steadily for a while. Over time, you might find that it stops working, right? So you might have to cut back to 1,800 calories to kickstart weight loss again. This is called metabolic adaptation. And you can no doubt see why it's a problem, right? So the more your metabolism adapts, the more you have to restrict your food intake. And so as a result, the harder it's going to be to achieve your goal and maintain your weight loss down the road, right? But carb cycling proponents say the approach can prevent metabolic adaptation. However, the rationale here is that, the rationale is essentially that, regularly mixing in high carb, high calorie days jumpstarts your metabolism and keeps it from adapting. Again, there's no strong evidence to support this claim, but it also hasn't been refuted either, right? And by the way, the metabolic adaptation is the same principle behind reverse dieting, another advanced nutrition strategy, right? And for those of you that have heard me talk about this many, many times, when you diet, you've got to have an exit strategy. You've got to reverse diet your calorie intake back up to maintenance because you can't live in a calorie deficit forever, right? Again, going back to what I was mentioning earlier there, like if fat intake is too low for too long, right, women can lose their menstrual cycle, right? Men, testosterone levels can drop, thyroid, so on and so forth, okay? All right, which brings me into number 2. Carb cycling may help regulate hormones affected by fat loss. So intense dieting can mess with your hormones, specifically leptin, thyroid hormones, right? T3, T4, TSH, reverse T3, and then reproductive hormones, right? Testosterone and estrogen, okay? So if you're trying to lose fat, leptin's a particular concern. Even though thyroid hormone, testosterone, and estrogen seem to get all the press, released by fat tissue, leptin plays a key role in hunger and metabolic adaptation. So the more body fat you have, the more leptin in your blood. Your brain uses leptin levels to make decisions about hunger, calorie intake, nutrient absorption, and energy use. All right. And that's a lot of factors related to fat loss. Now, here's when it gets interesting, right? When you reduce your calorie intake, even just for a few days, leptin levels drop as well. And this tells your brain you need to eat to prevent starvation. The takeaway here, though, is that leptin is one of the reasons you feel so hungry when you consistently eat less. And leptin is also considered the master controller of other hormones, meaning that when leptin drops, so do thyroid and reproductive hormones. All right. So what does this all have to do with carb cycling, right? The idea is this: by periodically eating more calories from carbohydrates, right, are known as, this process is known as like refeeding, our leptin levels will temporarily rise. So hypothetically, this would tell your brain that you are well fed, right, causing a temporary decrease in hunger and appetite. And because of this little high carb, high calorie break, it might feel easier to stick to a lower calorie intake on lower carb days. Plus, you could be less likely to experience the negative effects of not having enough of other important hormones. So there's some evidence for this, though it's very limited. What's more is kind of the refeeds, right, involved are usually longer than 1 day. Still, though, there may be very real psychological benefits, right? When you're generally eating lower carb and lower calorie, getting any higher carb, higher calorie day on purpose can feel really good physically and mentally, right? Who doesn't love a cheat day, right? All right. Number 3, carb cycling may make it easier to stick to a lower carbohydrate diet, right? So low carb diets can be effective for fat loss, especially for people with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. It should be noted, though, that they are not necessarily more effective than low fat, high carbohydrate diets. What counts as low carb? You might call any diet that provides fewer than 30% of your total daily calories from carbs a low carb diet. Experts often debate kind of the exact percentages here, with some saying it's 20% and others saying it's even less. The ketogenic diet, for example, right, a very popular form of low carb eating, is more specific. It's very low in carbs and very high in fat, usually less than 10% carbohydrate and more than 60% fat. And the though kind of the low carb and ketogenic diets can be effective for fat loss, most people can't stick with them over a long period of time. And this also goes for really any other kind of restricting eating style as well. So it's been suggested that alternating between lower carb and higher carb days may help people maintain a lower carb eating style and the results long-term, right? And so this, in this case, someone doing keto, this is referred to as cyclical ketogenic diet. And you can think of it this way, right? You eat a ketogenic diet most of the time, but have little mini breaks that last day or two where you can enjoy higher carb meals, right? All right, number 4, carb cycling may support athletic performance on a low carb diet. So the ketogenic diet is also sometimes used by athletes who want to be fat adapted, meaning fat adapted allows you to burn greater amounts of fat at higher exercise intensities. And this is according to several studies that have come out. And so burning more fat always sounds like a good thing, of course, right? But how might it help with exercise performance, right? And so that deserves a little more explanation here. So here's the background. To fuel long bouts of endurance exercise, your body normally relies heavily on carbohydrates stored in the form of glycogen. Unfortunately, your body can only store as much glycogen, or can only store so much glycogen at a time. So if you exercise long enough, you'll run low on carbs and have to slow down. That's why endurance athletes usually consume 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour during competitions. And it gives them more fuel so they can keep going hard, right? And this is where being fat adapted may come in handy, right? As many of us know all too well, right? It's easy for your body to store lots of fat in the form of fat tissue. And even very lean people have 15 times more energy available from stored fat than from stored carbohydrate. So if you become fat adapted, your body relies more heavily on fat, right, instead of carbs to fuel long endurance exercise. So that would mean you wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience, right, and potential GI distress of consuming an energy gel every 90 minutes during a longer exercise session, right? Plus, it might make you less likely to, bonk, right? Some have even suggested that being fat adapted could help improve exercise performance and recovery, though this is, again, debated by researchers. So keeping all of that in mind, right, all of the above is only referring to how a ketogenic, right, or low carb, high fat diet might benefit endurance performance. So how does carb cycling fit in, right? So the idea is this: you get fat adapted by eating a ketogenic diet for several days, but then you cycle in a couple of high carb days. These high carb days allow you to max out your glycogen stores, right? So the hope is that you can do this without disrupting the hypothetical performance benefits of the ketogenic diet. So combined, this could give you the best of both worlds, right? Lots of energy to burn from carbs and fat. However, it's important to note that the evidence doesn't currently support the performance benefits of a ketogenic diet on a wide scale. So based on what we know for now, most people, right, who try to adopt a cyclical ketogenic diet specifically because you want to perform better is most likely more trouble than it's worth, okay? Number 5, carb cycling may promote muscle gain without fat gain. So fat gain almost always accompanies muscle growth, right? But some carb cycling enthusiasts say the key to gaining muscle without gaining much fat is the hormone insulin. So whenever you eat carbohydrates, your blood sugar rises and insulin is released. Insulin helps regulate your blood sugar levels, right? And it also plays a key role in muscle growth and glycogen storage. So the hypothesis goes like this: if you eat high carb on days you resistance train, you can take advantage of insulin's muscle building and recovery properties. If you eat low carb on rest or conditioning workout days, you can simultaneously lose fat and improve insulin sensitivity, making the high carb days even more effective. Again, though, this is kind of the high level version, right? But what's the reality? Well, it's a lot more complicated than that, right? And there aren't any diet studies that support it. All right. So remember, we're not totally sure how, we're not totally sure about carb cycling. What are we a lot more confident in, right? If you look into the research, if you look into the world's leading experts in nutrition and so on and so forth, is the big rocks, right? Imagine this mason jar example, right? And you hear me talk about this all the time, right? But what are the big rocks? Everything else is the pebbles, the sand, the water, right? So the big rocks are the eating and lifestyle practices, right? This is the sleep, the nutrition, the exercise, the hydration, the stress management, right? The pebbles are all the things that help, right? But aren't totally necessary, right? The sand is purely a bonus, right? It may help, but it's not crucial, and it won't have a big impact, right? And so this idea here of kind of that mason jar example, basically would make carb cycling kind of, the sand, right? It's a bonus, potentially. It may help, but it's not crucial, and it won't have a big impact. All right. So how does carb cycling work, right? If you mean, can carb cycling help me lose fat and improve body composition? The answer is yes, as long as overall you are expending more calories than you are consuming, right? It might even work great for you if it's a good fit for your eating preferences and lifestyle. But if you mean it's, is it superior to other methods? That's hard to say because there's just a lack of evidence, right? So my take would be, if it provides any incremental benefits, right? Then great, right? But for most people, it's very high effort, low impact. All right. So just something to kind of consider there. All right. So who should try carb cycling? So carb cycling isn't right for everyone, right? It can work for specific types of people. You're most likely to benefit from carb cycling if you have your big rock habits down, right? If you're getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep every night, you're cooking the majority of your own food, you're eating lots of vegetables and fruits, you're eating an adequate amount of protein, you're staying hydrated, you're not abusing alcohol or caffeine, you're exercising consistently, you're managing stress, right? All these big rocks, then awesome. This is when you could take things up to the next level. This is where like kind of an intermediate to expert, this would be more so for them, right? So again, you're already eating lots of minimally processed whole foods and little highly processed foods. You're exercising, you're getting plenty of quality sleep, and you're eating mindfully. Because these big rocks are already in place, carb cycling becomes something to experiment with, right? So instead of being the primary method of achieving results, right, it's just something that you're experimenting with, right? And since we're not 100% sure carb cycling works in all scenarios, right, and in fact not even close to 100% sure, it's an important box to check before getting started, right? You got to have the big rocks down. All right. Another piece would be, you're already very lean, but you want to get leaner, right? So when you've already gotten super lean, your body will start to fight every last bit of fat loss. Cycling calorie and carb intake might help help with the metabolic adaptation piece of the equation there, right? That often occurs with a chronic ongoing calorie deficit, right? Plus, cycling intake can make a calorie deficit feel like less of a grind. And that's just because it lets you block off, eat less days into small manageable units instead of several weeks of miserable, hungry, just being miserable and starving there, right? Next piece would be, you want to manage training and nutritional stress, and are already implementing other key strategies, right? So if you're concerned about how the stress of hard training and chronic calorie deficit is affecting your hormones, you might consider carb cycling. All right, provided you are also doing other things to manage, your total stress load, like sleeping enough, meditation, practicing self-compassion, right? Periodically kind of topping off energy and carbohydrate stores. Can tell your body that everything's okay and starvation isn't imminent, right? And this is particularly useful for women, right, whose central hormonal regulation systems may be very sensitive to nutritional deficits, which is one of the reasons intermittent fasting isn't always so great for women, right? It's also useful for leaner people, right, who usually have less circulating leptin. And then for anybody who doesn't tolerate stress well or already has a high stress load, right? From there, you're trying to cut weight or change the appearance of your physique for competition, right? Carbohydrate intake affects fluid balance in the body, which can impact both weight and appearance on competition or shoot day. Or maybe you're aiming for incremental gains, right? So let's say you're an advanced lifter, you're already in great shape and you're pretty close to your genetic ceiling. Carb cycling might be the difference between you gaining 1 pound of muscle versus 3 pounds of muscle in a year. Right? For an advanced lifter, that's awesome progress. Okay. But let's say you're a beginner lifter, right? And you're just starting to make gains, right? Carb cycling probably won't make a big difference for you, and it might distract you from consistently implementing the big rocks that are going to push you forward. In fact, it'd be smart to keep this strategy in your back pocket in case you need it later on when you are more advanced and no longer benefiting from what we like to call newbie gains, right? Another example scenario here would be you don't tolerate carbs well, right? People with underlying metabolic issues such as poor blood sugar control or elevated inflammation may not feel great, think bloated and tired after eating large amounts of carbohydrates. So this group may nevertheless be able to use carbs effectively when active, so they may benefit from getting the bulk of their carb intake around workouts. Even better, with the time, right? With time and sustained activity, they may become more metabolically healthy, which means improved overall carb tolerance and more dietary flexibility. Another example, you have a solid handle on other aspects of your health, right? So changing your habits always comes at a cost, right? For example, carb cycling might cause you to interact less socially because of stricter rules and around meal times. Or let's say keeping track of how much and when you're supposed to eat makes you feel stressed and overwhelmed. In that case, carb cycling could have a negative effect on your mental health. Right? For some people, these trade-offs may be worth it. For others, not so much. Right? Next example would be you find an enjoyable way to eat. Right? So when it comes to nutrition, it's what you do consistently that matters most. Right? And you'll be much more likely to do what you enjoy. So if you hate this eating approach, it's probably not going to last long. Right? And so whether you carb cycle or eat low carb, low fat, paleo, plant-based, keto, it doesn't really matter, right? If you can follow an eating style consistently, it fits the life you want to live and you enjoy it and you'll get results, right? All right. So should you try carb cycling, right? This is just kind of some questions that you can ask yourself, right? So if like essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have you kind of rate this 0 to 5 for each one of these questions. Okay. So number 1, do you know what you hope to get out of carb cycling? Right? Do you want to lose fat? Do you want to gain muscle? Do you want to better regulate stress or hormones? Right? On a scale from 0 to 5, 0 would be no idea. 5 would be 100% clear. Where would you rank on that? Okay. Write that number down. Number 2, are you looking for a body composition or a body transformation or smaller incremental gains, right? So consider, is this the first step of your nutrition journey or one of the last, right? So again, transformation here would be a 0, right? Smaller gains would be a 5. Okay, so record 0 to 5, where would you rank? Number 3, have you already tried less advanced strategies? Example, eating more veggies to accomplish your goal, right? Consider, is there anything less complex you could try first? So if there's no previous steps before, you give yourself a 0, right? If you've tried everything else, you'd give yourself a 5. All right, number 4, are you already consistent and confident with your big rock habits, right? So consider, will you be able to keep up with your fundamental nutritional practices while you carb cycle? right? So if you give yourself a 0, that would mean that you're not consistent at all. If you're super confident, you'd give yourself a 5. All right, next question. How comfortable are you with rigid eating rules? Right, so something to consider here. How do you feel about needing to eat exactly 5 meals or exactly 6 portions of lean protein each day, for example? Right, if flexibility is very important, you'd give yourself a 0. If you're okay with those rules for now, give yourself a 5. Right, where would you rank 0 to 5? Right, number 6, do you feel comfortable treating carb cycling as an experiment? Right, so consider, are you okay trying carb cycling even if ultimately your experiment determines that this style of eating isn't for you? Right, so you give yourself a 0 on this if your answer was no, I need to be sure it'll work. All right, and you give yourself a 5 if you're like, I'm all in for experimentation. All right, question number 7, are you okay with making trade-offs to follow a specific eating style? Right, so something to consider here. How would carb cycling impact the way you eat at social gatherings or family meals? Right, are there foods you might have to skip out on that you normally enjoy? So give yourself a 0 here if you're not okay with that. You'd give yourself a 5 if you're totally comfortable with that. Okay, question number 8, will following a super specific eating plan stress you out? Right, so something to consider here. Does the idea of not being able to wing it with your nutrition in a restaurant or when you are running low on groceries, for example, sound stressful? So give yourself a 0 if that sounds extremely stressful. Give yourself a 5 if you're like, I'm good with a specific plan, right? Anywhere from 0 to 5. All right, so when you add up all of your numbers there, right, and you get your total score, this is how it kind of break down. So carb cycling's a go if you're anywhere from 32 to 40. If you added up those 8 questions there and your total was anywhere between 32 and 40, it sounds like you are in a great place to give carb cycling a try. All right, you're clear on your goals, your big rocks are in place, and you are willing to make the trade-offs. If you fall anywhere between 24 and 31, you need to proceed with caution, right? Carb cycling may or may not make sense for you. If you still like to give it a try, use outcome-based decision-making, right? Using the data you collect about your experience to decide what to do next as you experiment with one of the protocols below, right? Or one of the protocols that I've listed, right? Basically, that means checking in with yourself and being honest about how it's going for you. And then if you score between 0 and 23, right, I would consider keeping carb cycling in your back pocket. Right? It looks like you'd benefit from less advanced nutrition and health practices, right? That doesn't mean you should never try carb cycling in the future, but these fundamental practices include, like I said before, eating lean protein with meals, choosing minimally processed whole foods most of the time, consuming several servings of colorful veggies each day, getting restful sleep, reducing stress, right? And there's many others as well, right? But this is just a way for you to be able to kind of give yourself a quiz and figure out, is this right for you? All right, and then that last component here we're going to go over is how to carb cycle for fat loss or muscle gain. Okay, so there's a lot of different carb cycling methods out there depending upon your goals and your nutritional experience. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to essentially kind of build out, right? So if you want to customize your carb cycling schedule, right, then you will need to essentially determine your baseline nutrition needs first, right? How many calories do you need? What should those macros look like? Right. Ultimately, no matter which cycling strategy you use, total calorie and macronutrient intake for the week should remain the same as if you are not cycling. All right. So for example, let's say you're looking to gain muscle, right? And you've determined that your intake is 210 grams of protein. You need 100 grams of fat and 250 grams of carbs. Okay. So on a typical diet, that's what you try to eat every day, right? So to apply these numbers to carb cycling, start by multiplying the recommended daily carb intake by 7, right? That's your total carb intake for the week, all right? And so based off your carb cycling method, you'll adjust your carb intake for a given meal or day, right? You'll eat you'll eat the same amount of carbs as you would without carb cycling, but distribute them a little differently throughout the day or week, right? Your fat and protein amounts will be the same every day, okay? So second component of this is make sure you treat carb cycling as an experience, as an experiment, right? And so like I'd covered earlier, right? Carb cycling isn't a super reliable method for getting results. That means it may or may not work for you. And because carb cycling requires a decent amount of energy and attention, it's important to treat it like an experiment until you understand how well it fits into your life, right? And so this is just something, again, to consider there. All right. So to set up your carb cycling experience, or to set up your carb cycling experiment, here's what you need to consider. All right. What's the goal that you're trying to achieve? All right. How will you know if you're making progress? Will you measure your weight, body composition, growth measurements, exercise performance? All right. How often will you check in to determine whether you're making progress or not? Right. And so what I would recommend is, you need to be tracking this stuff. You need to be assessing, evaluating, right? This is literally a self-experimentation. Okay. So going back to the different carb cycling plans, number one, you can use high/low days. Okay. So this carb and calorie cycling approach is very simple and is based on your level of daily activity. Okay. So again, first you need to calculate your average daily needs with calories and macros first. Then you'll fluctuate your daily carb intake as follows. Okay. So on days with minimal physical activity, you'll eat mostly protein, vegetables, and healthy fats with minimal carbs. So about 20 to 25% of your estimated daily carbs, whether in grams. So let me bring that back. So on days with minimal physical activity, you will eat mostly protein, vegetables, and healthy fats with minimal carbs. About 25 to 50% of your estimated daily carb needs. Okay. All right, let's see here. To put this in context, let's assume, right, that you were estimated to need an average of 8. Let's see, let me bring it back. So let's assume you were estimated to need an average of 250 grams of carbs daily, right? So on your days with minimal activity, you'd aim for about 62 to 125 grams of carbs. And on your days with lots of physical activity, you'd have about 375 to 435 grams of carbs. Okay. All right. So carb cycling plan number 2. Okay. So use post-workout / anytime meals, right? So another approach is to put the bulk of a day's carbohydrate intake in the meal that follows physical activity, right? Post-workout meal, while minimizing carbohydrates at other meals. Okay. So that's another strategy there that you could complete. Essentially, what would happen here is that the anytime meals, right? So all the meals outside of the post-workout meal, right? You would have, basically, again, mainly protein, fats, and vegetables, right? And then and you can also have more high fiber, slower digesting carbohydrates, right? Like beans, lentils, fruit, right? But essentially you want, fewer than 25% of your total calories for that meal, right? And then the post-workout meal, right? This is going to be, again, what takes place right after your workout, right? Or physical activity, right? And this meal type, essentially helps us take advantage of the body's metabolic response to exercise and improve glucose tolerance that occurs during the post-exercise period, right? Or any period following high amounts of physical activity, right? And so in this meal, what we're looking for the protein, we're looking for the healthy fat, and then we're also looking for a large serving of carbohydrates. Generally, 50% or more of the calories for that meal should be carbohydrates, right? So, I mean, kind of when you think about the iCoach plate that I've mentioned many, many times, right? That anytime meal, we're looking for, quarter plate protein, quarter plate carb, half plate color with the post-workout meal. And this, if you were doing the carb cycling in this approach, you'd fill up like half of your plate with carbohydrates, quarter of your plate with color, quarter of your plate with protein. Okay. So really, if you're looking at this on non-workout days, choose one meal to be post-workout, and then breakfast and on breakfast and dinner would be, typically the so let me take that back. On non-workout days, right? Choose one meal to be post-workout. Breakfast and dinner are the most common options typically. Okay. So again, kind of example of this would be like, if I had a workout, if Monday was a workout day, if Tuesday was no workout, but still physically active, and then Wednesday was no workout and not physically active. What this could look like is meal 1 would be an anytime meal. Then you'd work out. Then meal 2 would be a post-workout meal. Meal 3 would be an anytime meal. Meal 4 would be an anytime meal. On the Tuesday, meal 1 would be an anytime meal. You would ride, bike to work or work physically active job. Meal 2 would be a post-workout meal. Meal 3 would be an anytime meal. And then meal 4 would be an anytime meal. And then on Wednesday, no workout, not physically active at all. Meal 1 would be a post-workout meal. Meal 2 would be an anytime meal. Meal 3, anytime meal. Meal 4, anytime meal. And again, this just, I mean, it doesn't, you don't have to eat 4 meals a day. It really just depends again on, who are we talking about here, right? And something to mention too with these advanced carb cycling methods, more advanced forms of carb cycling can be used by people like elite, amateur, professional athletes, people whose income is tied to their appearance, like models, bodybuilding, figure competitors, things like that. But again, this is not for most people, right? This is most of the general population. This is not going to be a sustainable approach for you. More so, maybe something that you could experiment with. All right, so carb cycling, how is it really working for you, right? So after you've been carb cycling for at least 2 weeks, use this assessment to decide if this eating strategy is working for you. So think about your recent experiences with carb cycling, right? Then choose the number, right? You're reflecting in your head here, you can write this down as well. That best matches how strongly you agree with the following statements, okay? So on a scale of 1, which would be never, to 10, always, most of the time when I eat this way, I feel pretty good in general, right? So 0 would be never, 10 would be always. On a scale from 0 to 10, where would you rank yourself? Number 2, compared to how I was eating before, I feel better when carb cycling. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. Question number 3, when I carb cycle, I have reliable, sustained energy without crashing. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. Question number 4, carb cycling feels doable and it fits into my everyday life. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. When I carb cycle, I feel good mentally and emotionally. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. Question 6, I feel confident and capable cooking and preparing meals while carb cycling. Never would be 0, 10 would be always. Number 7, when I carb cycle, I feel I am consistently keeping up with the other nutrition, fitness, and health practices that make me feel my best. So 0 for never, 10 for always. Question number 8, when I carb cycle, I rarely struggle with food cravings or urges to overeat. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. When I carb cycle, I digest my food well. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. Question number 10, I'm performing and recovering well while carb cycling. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. On social occasions such as going out with friends to a restaurant, I can almost always find something I enjoy and feel comfortable eating. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. Again, we're on a sliding scale here from 0 to 10. Question number 12, I feel calm and relaxed about my food choices. It's no big deal, just part of life. 0 would be never, 10 would be always. Question number 13, if other people pressure me to do something differently or my style of eating doesn't match others around me, I'm able to follow my own cues or goals. Scale from 0 to 10. Question number 14, carb cycling is helping me eat in a way that matches my specific goals for health, fitness, performance, etc. 0 to 10. And last question here, number 15, I feel I can still truly enjoy food, how it tastes, and the experience of eating it. Scale from 0 to 10. All right, so add up your total score, right? From there, 120 and above, you're crushing it, right? This way of eating is working beautifully for you. Keep on doing your thing. If you got 105 to 119, this is promising, right? Overall, things are going well with your carb cycling experiment. You might consider making some small changes, but it looks like you're moving in the right direction. If your score was 76 to 104, these are mixed results, right? So carb cycling might be working well for you in some areas, but you're probably struggling in others. Consider if there are any tweaks you can make that would make it feel more sustainable. And then from there, less than 75, carb cycling is not working for you. Based on this assessment, you're experiencing some issues with the carb cycling protocol you are currently following. Success depends on a plan you can stick with consistently that has minimal trade-offs. And so, don't feel bad about this, right? This experiment helped you to understand something important. Carb cycling may not be for you, at least not right now, right? And so, carb cycling may or may not work for you, right? No matter what happens during your carb cycling experience, remember this, it's all okay, right? You might learn that you just can't stick to a carb cycling regimen, right? Or that you feel terrible when carb cycling, or maybe you feel great, or perhaps you learn that carb cycling is your favorite way of eating, right? Or that it's just not worth all the effort, or something else, right? It's all good. The key is to keep an open mind and go with the best available evidence, right? Your own personal experience based on, everything that we've talked about here today on the podcast, right? Collect your data, then reflect on how things are going. And if you stick to the facts, you can't go wrong. All right. So there was a lot here, right? And as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm always happy to help. But I just wanted to kind of do a really in-depth podcast here on carb cycling. I hope this helps. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Let me know. But I appreciate all of you that listen to the podcast and support iCoach Nutrition. And yeah, anything that I can do to help you to add value to your life, please let me know. We are 5 years strong here at iCoach Nutrition, and I'm looking forward to the next 5 years here moving forward. So again, thank you for your support, and I hope you all have an amazing day, amazing week. We'll chat here soon. Thanks, guys. Bye.